Hello everyone, welcome to The Historian Sleep, where history comes alive with drama and inspiration, sparking deep reflections on both the past and the present. Imagine this: in just over a decade, Germany rose from economic crisis to a mighty world power, then plunged headlong into the darkness of war and devastation. What transformed a civilized society into the most brutal war machine of the 20th century. The story of the Third Reich's rise and collapse is more than history. It's a warning to all of us today. Join us as we uncover the secrets, intrigues, and profound lessons hidden within one of humanity's darkest chapters. Berlin, January 1933. A bitter wind sweeps through the Unter den Linden as gray clouds hang low over the city's grand avenues. On street corners, men in tattered coats sell newspapers whose headlines scream of economic collapse and political paralysis. The Great War has been over for nearly 15 years, yet the wounds it left in the German soul are fresh and aching. Veterans, some missing limbs, others missing hope, shuffle past posters of rival parties promising salvation. Hyperinflation has devoured savings, unemployment gnaws at families, and the fragile Weimar Republic lurches from one coalition crisis to the next. This is the landscape into which Adolf Hitler strides. To a nation battered by humiliation and hardship, his words of national revival cut through the despair like a trumpet. Many Germans desperate for order hear a promise that life can be restored to a proud normalcy. Yet beneath the applause lies something darker, a vision of unity built on exclusion, a utopia defined by whom it casts out. The seeds of totalitarian rule were sown in the final years of the 1920s when the Great Depression struck like a hammer. By 1932, unemployment soared to nearly 1 in 3 workers. Entire neighborhoods lined up for thin bowls of soup while factories stood silent behind rusting gates. The Reichstag, Germany's parliament, descended into chaos, its factions unable to form a stable government. For many ordinary citizens, clerks in Hamburg, farmers in Bavaria, machinists in the Ruhr democracy felt less like a safeguard than a slow-moving disaster. Amid this turmoil, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, once a fringe movement, surged to prominence. Hitler's oratory was not merely political speech. It was theater, a hypnotic performance that mixed fiery nationalism with a carefully crafted image of personal destiny. He spoke of restoring honor stolen at Versailles, of rebuilding industry, of reclaiming German greatness. To the weary shopkeeper in Cologne or the veterans still haunted by the mud of Flanders, these promises carried a dangerous allure. By January 30th, 1933, the political deadlock reached its breaking point. Conservative elites, believing they could control the firebrand, persuaded President Paul von Hindenburg to appoint Hitler as chancellor. Celebratory torchlight parades filled Berlin's avenues that night, their flickering flames casting long shadows across the Brandenburg Gate. Few realized those shadows were an omen of the darkness to come. Within weeks, the veneer of democratic restraint began to crack. On February 27th, the Reichstag building erupted in flames, a spectacular fire whose origins remain debated to this day. The Nazi leadership seized the moment. Claiming a communist plot, Hitler persuaded Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag Fire Decree, suspending fundamental civil liberties, freedom of the press, of speech, of assembly. Suddenly, the legal protections of the Weimar Constitution were little more than paper. The machinery of oppression moved quickly. Stormtroopers patrolled the streets, dragging political opponents from their homes in the dead of night. Newspapers critical of the new government were silenced. Editors who refused to bend were arrested. Only weeks later, the Enabling Act granted Hitler the power to enact laws without parliamentary consent. Germany, still calling itself a republic, had effectively become a dictatorship. For the average Berliner sipping coffee in a smoky cafe, the transformation felt at once rapid and strangely ordinary. Streetcars still clanged along their tracks. Children still darted through the Tiergarten chasing kites. Yet subtle changes were everywhere. Red flags bearing the swastika fluttered from public buildings. Radio broadcasts now carried a single insistent message of national rebirth. Dissenting voices faded first to whispers, then to silence. While some welcomed the new order, seeing in it the end of chaos, others sensed the gathering storm. Jewish shopkeepers noticed sudden drops in customers as propaganda painted them as outsiders. Intellectuals and artists whispered of friends questioned by the Gestapo. The air itself seemed to tighten as if the country were drawing a collective breath before a plunge. The Nazis wasted no time identifying their enemies. Communists and Social Democrats were the first targets, but soon the circle widened. In back rooms of ministries and police headquarters, officials drafted decrees that would reach into every corner of German society. This was not random repression. It was the calculated construction of a racial state where belonging was defined by blood. And yet for many ordinary Germans, life in those early months could appear deceptively stable, even hopeful. Unemployment figures showed the first signs of improvement as the regime launched public works programs and promised an end to the humiliation of Versailles. Families who had known only scarcity were eager to believe that a strong hand at the helm could steer the nation toward prosperity. But prosperity came at a cost hidden beneath the pageantry of rallies and the rhythm of marching boots. Each new policy tightened the grip of the state. The press-muzzled unions dismantled local governments replaced by Nazi appointees. What could not be controlled outright was drowned in propaganda, a relentless drumbeat of films, posters, and speeches that celebrated and idealized German people while vilifying anyone deemed other. It is easy in hindsight to imagine that the danger was obvious, that resistance should have been universal. Yet history rarely unfolds in such stark contrast for those living it. In 1933, many citizens were simply trying to keep their jobs, feed their children, and find a sense of stability after years of crisis. The line between accommodation and complicity blurred, and the cost of defiance grew with every passing week. Thus, the stage was set for the next more brutal phase of the regime, the systematic persecution of minorities and the remolding of society to fit the Nazi ideal. What began with promises of national renewal would soon harden into laws of exclusion, violence, and ultimately mass murder. The shadows that lengthened over Germany in those early months were not fleeting. They were the darkness of an entire era descending. The Reichstag fire in February 1933 was more than a blaze in a parliamentary building. It was the spark that ignited a legal revolution. When flames devoured the Grand Chamber's timbered roof, Berliners crowded the streets, their breath frosting in the late winter air as sirens wailed. Firefighters battled the inferno through the night, but by dawn only a charred shell remained. Hitler, barely a month into his chancellorship, pounced on the calamity. He proclaimed the fire the opening act of a communist uprising, a claim he repeated with theatrical fury at rallies and in radio broadcasts. Many historians still debate whether the Nazis staged the fire or simply seized the opportunity. But what is beyond debate is how swiftly the event became a pretext for dismantling democracy. President Paul von Hindenburg, aged and weary, was persuaded, some say bullied, into signing the Reichstag fire decree on February 28th. This single document stripped away fundamental rights, freedom of speech, of the press, of assembly, of privacy in one's home or mail. Overnight, Germany shifted from a fragile democracy to a state where dissent itself was criminal. Civil liberties that had survived the chaos of the 1920s were now ink on paper, easily swept aside. Stormtroopers, the brown-shirted SA, poured into the streets with a new mandate. They smashed the offices of socialist newspapers, dragged union leaders from their beds, and filled makeshift jails with political prisoners. Tens of thousands were arrested in the weeks following the decree. For many Berlin families, the soft knock at midnight became a sound of terror, a quiet rhythm of boots and whispered commands. Yet the Nazis understood that brute force alone would not secure lasting power. They needed a facade of legality to win the loyalty, or at least the acquiescence of millions. On March 23, 1933, Hitler addressed the Reichstag from the ornate Kroll Opera House, draped now with blood-red banners bearing black swastikas. His speech, part menace and part prophecy, urged deputies to pass the Enabling Act granting his cabinet authority to enact laws without parliamentary approval. Surrounded by SA men whose silent presence was a threat in itself, the deputies voted yes, save for a courageous bloc of Social Democrats who opposed and were soon arrested. With a single vote, the constitutional republic created in 1919 ceased to function. The dictatorship was now clothed in legality. The transformation of everyday governance began immediately. State parliaments were dissolved or replaced by Nazi-appointed governors. Trade unions, once a pillar of working-class life, were outlawed in favor of the German Labor Front, a party-controlled organization that eliminated strikes and enforced loyalty. Newspapers and radio stations were brought under the tight supervision of Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda, their editors instructed to publish only material that served the national community. What had been a cacophony of political voices only months earlier became a single echoing chorus. For many Germans, the changes arrived like a sudden shift of weather, startling, but not wholly unwelcome. After years of economic depression and street violence between rival political factions, the new order promised stability. Shopkeepers in Munich spoke of safer streets. Factory owners in the Ruhr welcomed the end of labor unrest. Even families wary of the Nazis found themselves breathing easier when paychecks resumed and unemployment numbers dipped. It was a trade-off that seemed at first almost reasonable, a little less freedom for a little more order, but the price of that bargain revealed itself quickly. In April 1933, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service dismissed Jewish teachers, professors, judges, and government employees. These were neighbors and colleagues, men and women who had fought in the Great War, shared classrooms, attended the same concerts in Leipzig or Frankfurt. Now overnight, they were branded outsiders. Posters appeared in shop windows warning customers not to buy from Jewish businesses. Children were taught to sing playground rhymes, mocking classmates with non-Aryan heritage. The SA and the newly expanded SS, once merely Hitler's bodyguard, now a powerful paramilitary force under Heinrich Himmler, enforced these decrees with ruthless precision. They organized boycotts, marched through Jewish districts, and established the first concentration camps. Dachau opened in March 1933 near Munich. Initially held political prisoners, communists, social democrats, and outspoken critics of the regime. Its barbed wire and watchtowers foreshadowed the vast network of camps that would later darken Europe. Outside the major cities, life in small towns and rural villages carried a deceptive normalcy. Farmers still brought milk to market, bakers kneaded dough before dawn, children played in meadow grass that smelled of spring rain. Yet local party officials arrived with new expectations. Mayors were replaced by Nazi loyalists. Church choirs were pressed to sing patriotic hymns. Teachers were ordered to open classes with the stiff arm salute. Even the rhythms of Sunday worship felt the subtle pressure of a regime intent on bending faith to its will. The Nazi message was clear: there would be no corner of German life untouched. Sports clubs, cultural associations, and professional guilds were either co-opted or disbanded. The Hitler Youth expanded rapidly, offering uniforms, camping trips, and a sense of purpose to boys and girls alike. Membership was not yet mandatory, but social pressure made refusal difficult. A child without a brown shirt risked isolation. A parent who objected risked scrutiny. Meanwhile, opponents who tried to organize resistance found themselves isolated and hunted. The Communist Party was crushed, its leaders executed or exiled. The Social Democratic Party was outlawed. Liberal intellectuals who had once debated policy in Berlin cafes fled abroad, joining a growing diaspora of German writers, scientists, and artists who warned the world of what was coming. Among them was Albert Einstein, who would later remark that he left not only for his safety, but because as long as I have any choice, I will only stay in a country where political liberty, tolerance, and equality of all citizens before the law are the rule. For those who remained, a subtle dread seeped into daily routines. Conversations in tramcars grew guarded. Letters carried an unspoken caution, as if invisible eyes read every word. Neighbors who once shared friendly gossip now hesitated before speaking each other's names. Germany was becoming a society where silence itself was a survival strategy. Yet remarkably many citizens viewed these changes through the lens of national pride. Public works projects promised new jobs. Soldiers marched in crisp formations that spoke of renewed strength. Hitler's speeches broadcast over millions of inexpensive radios distributed by the state celebrated a people's community, a Volksgemeinschaft, united by destiny and blood. The rhetoric stirred something ancient and tribal, a longing for belonging after years of defeat and humiliation. By the summer of 1933, political opposition had been all but erased. The law against the formation of new parties declared the Nazi Party the sole political organization in Germany. Flags bearing the swastika fluttered from every public building. Portraits of Hitler adorned classrooms and offices. Children learned songs praising the Führer before they could spell his name. The transformation was astonishing not only for its speed, but for the quiet compliance with which it unfolded. Still under the surface of pageantry and apparent unity, fear remained the regime's most potent weapon. Gestapo informants blended into the crowd at every rally, listening for careless words. A neighbor's denunciation could lead to interrogation or worse. The knowledge that anyone might be listening fostered a self-censorship more effective than any written law. Thus, within a single year, Germany had crossed the threshold from troubled democracy to totalitarian state. The Reichstag fire and the Enabling Act were not merely historical events. They were the instruments by which a modern nation surrendered its freedoms for the illusion of strength. What followed, the systematic persecution of minorities, the indoctrination of youth, the drive toward war, would be the grim fulfillment of a process that began almost quietly with a fire on a cold February night. Once Hitler's grip on power was secure, the new regime turned its full attention to reshaping the population itself. The Nazis envisioned a people's community, but the definition of who belonged was ruthlessly narrow. In their ideology, citizenship and worth were determined by race and conformity to a mythical Aryan ideal. Anyone outside that circle, Jews, Roma, the disabled political dissidents, and many others, became targets for exclusion or annihilation. The earliest and most visible focus was the Jewish population, long scapegoated in Europe, but now cast as Germany's ultimate enemy. Only weeks after the Enabling Act, the law for the restoration of the professional civil service dismissed Jewish teachers, professors, doctors, judges, and government employees. Entire careers were ended with a single decree. Students arrived at schools to find beloved instructors missing. Patients learned that trusted physicians could no longer practice. In Berlin's bustling university district, lecture halls once alive with debate fell silent as Jewish scholars were expelled. Economic life soon followed the same pattern of erasure. On April 1, 1933, Nazi paramilitaries launched a nationwide boycott of Jewish businesses. Brown-shirted SA men stationed themselves outside shops, daubing Stars of David on windows and intimidating customers. Posters warned, "Do not buy from Jews." For shopkeepers who had served their communities for decades, it was a day of humiliation and fear. Some neighbors defied the boycott in quiet acts of solidarity, slipping in through back doors to make purchases, but many stayed away wary of retaliation. Legislation multiplied. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 stripped Jews of citizenship and prohibited marriage or sexual relations between Jews and Aryans. The laws reached with surgical precision into private life. A young couple in love could be torn apart by a bureaucrat's racial chart. A family could wake to find themselves stateless in their own homeland. Identity became a matter of ancestry, not belief or behavior, and the state demanded proof of pure German blood back through grandparents. The assault was not limited to Jews. The Nazis viewed a wide spectrum of people as undesirable or asocial. Roma and Sinti, often called gypsies in contemporary accounts, faced harassment, forced sterilization, and later deportation to camps where entire families perished. Homosexual men were arrested under an expanded interpretation of paragraph 175 of the German Criminal Code. Thousands were sent to concentration camps and made to wear the pink triangle badge. Jehovah's Witnesses were imprisoned for refusing to swear allegiance to the regime or serve in the military. Political opponents who escaped the first wave of arrests were hunted down and silenced. Particularly chilling was the regime's campaign against people with disabilities. Influenced by twisted interpretations of eugenics, Nazi leaders declared that those with hereditary illnesses or mental disabilities were a drain on the national body. In 1934, the law for the prevention of genetically diseased offspring mandated the forced sterilization of individuals with conditions ranging from schizophrenia to simple physical deformities. Special hereditary health courts decided the fate of thousands, often after perfunctory hearings. Entire institutions became factories of involuntary surgery. By 1939, the policy escalated into a secret program of mass murder known as Action T4. Doctors and administrators, many respected professionals, selected patients deemed unworthy of life. Under the guise of medical care, they were transported to designated clinics and killed by lethal injection or gas. Buses with blacked-out windows became a grim symbol of disappearance. Families received letters claiming their loved ones had died of pneumonia or sudden heart failure, the lies thinly veiled but impossible to challenge. Historians estimate that between 70,000 and 100,000 people, including at least 20,000 children, were murdered in this phase alone. These actions were not carried out in secret from the German public. Rumors spread quickly. Smoke from crematoria drifted over villages near killing centers. Yet many citizens looked away, convinced by propaganda that these measures were necessary for national health. Posters depicted the disabled as economic burdens, calculating the supposed cost of their care and contrasting it with the needs of healthy families. The message was relentless compassion was weakness, and weakness threatened the vogue. The Nazi obsession with racial purity seeped into daily routines. School curricula were revised to include pseudo-scientific lessons on genetics and racial hierarchy. Textbooks showed grotesque caricatures of Jews and charts ranking human types. Teachers were required to join the National Socialist Teachers League and were encouraged to report any child whose family expressed dissenting views. Classrooms once devoted to math and literature now doubled as laboratories of indoctrination. Violence reinforced the message. One of the most notorious eruptions came on the night of November 10, 1938, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Across Germany and Austria, synagogues went up in flames, their stained glass windows shattering into glittering shards that littered the streets. Jewish homes and shops were ransacked. Men were beaten in front of their families, and nearly 30,000 were arrested and sent to concentration camps. Fire brigades were ordered not to extinguish burning synagogues unless adjacent Aryan property was at risk. The event was not a riot, but a state-orchestrated pogrom, a public declaration that Jewish life in Germany was to be destroyed. For the Jewish community, Kristallnacht was a terrifying turning point. Emigration, already difficult, became a desperate imperative. Lines formed outside foreign embassies as families sought visas to anywhere that would take them: Palestine, the United States, Britain, Shanghai. Many countries burdened by their own economic woes or swayed by anti-Semitic sentiment turned refugees away. Ships left European ports carrying those lucky enough to escape, while countless others found borders closed and hope dwindling. By 1941, the machinery of persecution had tightened into a system of near total confinement. Jews were forced to wear the yellow Star of David on their clothing. Curfews restricted movement. Property was confiscated. Ration cards were stamped with a J to limit access to food. Deportations to ghettos in occupied Poland began a grim prelude to the mass exterminations that would follow. Communities that had thrived for centuries, merchants in Frankfurt, scholars in Vienna, artisans in small Bavarian towns, were emptied in a matter of months. The repression extended beyond those the Nazis targeted for extermination. German society as a whole was pressured to conform to a narrow ideal of loyalty and obedience. Neighbors were encouraged to denounce one another for defeatist remarks. Children in the Hitler Youth were told it was their duty to report even their own parents if they spoke against the regime. The Gestapo operated with relatively few officers because they could rely on ordinary citizens to supply a steady stream of accusations. Fear became a social glue binding people to the state through silence and suspicion, and yet scattered pockets of resistance flickered. The confessing church, led by pastors such as Dietrich Bonhoeffer, challenged the Nazification of Christianity and sheltered some victims. Student groups like the White Rose distributed anti-Nazi leaflets, an act of extraordinary courage given the consequences. Even small gestures, hiding a Jewish neighbor sharing food with a Roma family refusing to salute, were acts of quiet defiance that carried mortal risk. By the late 1930s, the dream of a pure German society was no longer a hidden agenda. It was official policy enforced through law, violence, and terror. What began as discriminatory decrees had evolved into a comprehensive system of persecution. The average German could not claim ignorance. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and the visible absence of neighbors testified to the regime's brutality. Yet for many, economic improvement and the allure of national pride outweighed moral outrage. Some were true believers. Others convinced themselves they were powerless. Both responses allowed the machinery of repression to run with lethal efficiency. The story of Nazi Germany's systematic persecution is not only a chronicle of cruelty, but a warning about how quickly a society can be conditioned to accept the unacceptable. Rights were not abolished in one dramatic stroke. They were chipped away through laws, propaganda, and the calculated use of fear. By the time the full horror of the Holocaust unfolded the groundwork, the normalization of exclusion, the habit of silence, had already been laid. By the autumn of 1938, Germany had already spent 5 years steeped in propaganda that painted Jews and other minorities as dangerous outsiders. Anti-Semitic laws had steadily tightened the vice Jews barred from civil service. Their businesses marked their citizenship nullified. Yet the night of November 9/10 brought a new and terrifying chapter 1 that shattered any illusion that this persecution might remain confined to paperwork and prejudice. The spark was the assassination of a German diplomat in Paris by a young Polish Jew named Herschel Grinspan. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's master of propaganda, seized the incident as a pretext for a nationwide spontaneous uprising. In reality, the attack provided the perfect excuse for a carefully orchestrated pogrom. Orders went out quietly to local Nazi officials and the SA unleashed destruction, but avoid harming non-Jewish property. As darkness fell on November 9th, mobs of stormtroopers and Hitler Youth fanned out through cities, towns, and villages. Synagogues blazed across the Reich, over 250 in one night. The stained glass windows of centuries-old houses of worship exploded outward in showers of glittering shards that littered the cobblestones, giving the event its chilling name, Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. In Berlin, firefighters arrived promptly, but were instructed only to keep flames from spreading to adjacent Aryan buildings. Sacred scrolls burned while neighbors watched from curtained windows, some in fear, some in silence, a few in quiet approval. Jewish homes and businesses suffered the same fate. Shop fronts were smashed with hammers, merchandise hurled into the streets. Furniture was overturned, paintings slashed, valuables looted or destroyed. Children's toys lay crushed among the debris while boots trampled over prayer books. In many towns, the smell of smoke and scorched wood hung heavy through the night, seeping into the clothing of those forced to stand and witness. Violence against people was as rampant as the destruction of property. Jewish men were dragged from their beds, beaten in alleys, and paraded through the streets to jeers and spit. Women and children cowered behind doors as SA men pounded with rifle butts. By dawn, at least 90 Jews were dead. Some were murdered outright, others driven to suicide after the night's terror. Roughly 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and shipped to concentration camps such as Dachau, Buchenwald, and Sachsenhausen, many experiencing brutal treatment that left lasting injuries or death. The official German press framed Kristallnacht as a popular reaction, but few were deceived. Eyewitnesses reported seeing Nazi officials coordinating attacks, and police were ordered not to interfere. Insurance companies were forbidden to reimburse Jewish property owners for damages, while the government imposed a collective fine of 1 billion Reichsmarks on the Jewish community, forcing victims to pay for the wreckage of their own lives. In the months that followed, Jews were banned from owning businesses, attending cultural events, or even walking in certain public spaces. Emigration, already difficult, became a desperate priority. For many ordinary Germans, the night was a turning point. Some were horrified by the wanton cruelty. Diaries and private letters reveal a quiet shock even among those who had accepted earlier anti-Semitic policies. Yet open protest was rare. Fear of the Gestapo kept voices low, and the economic rewards of Aryanized businesses' properties sold for a fraction of their value tempted many to complicity. Neighbors who once exchanged greetings across fences now avoided eye contact as families packed their belongings, seeking visas that were increasingly impossible to obtain. Kristallnacht did more than destroy synagogues and shops. It shattered the illusion clung to by some Jews and Gentiles alike that the Nazi regime might eventually moderate, or that persecution might remain nonviolent. It signaled a decisive escalation from discrimination to physical annihilation. Historian Saul Friedlander later described it as a nationwide dress rehearsal for the Holocaust, a visible rehearsal of methods coordinated terror, state-sanctioned theft, mass detention that would soon be applied on an unimaginable scale. Outside Germany, the world reacted with outrage but little action. Newspapers from New York to London carried photographs of smoldering synagogues and battered faces. Foreign governments issued formal protests. Some ambassadors were briefly recalled. Yet most nations, burdened by the lingering Great Depression and wary of refugees, tightened immigration quotas rather than loosened them. The Evian conference earlier that year had already shown how reluctant the international community was to accept large numbers of Jewish refugees. Kristallnacht underscored the tragic consequences of that inaction. Within Germany, the aftermath was methodical. The Reich confiscated insurance payouts, ensuring that rebuilding was nearly impossible. Jewish children were expelled from public schools. Professionals, doctors, lawyers, artists lost their licenses. Curfews restricted movement. Even the smallest acts of daily life became hurdles: buying food, traveling by train, mailing a letter. Jews were forced to carry special identification papers stamped with a red J, and their passports were invalid unless marked with the same letter. Beyond the Jewish community, other groups felt the tightening grip of repression. Roma families were rounded up and subjected to racial biology examinations that determined who would be sterilized or deported. Homosexual men, already targeted under paragraph 175, saw increased raids on gathering places and harsher sentences. Jehovah's Witnesses, steadfast in refusing military service or the Hitler salute, faced renewed imprisonment in camps where they wore purple triangles on their uniforms. The Nazi state's machinery of control had become indiscriminate in its appetite. For the general population, the message was unmistakable. The regime's power was absolute, and mercy would not temper it. The Gestapo's network of informants deepened the climate of fear. A careless remark in a cafe could lead to interrogation. Teachers were required to report parents who questioned official policy. Children in the Hitler Youth were encouraged to denounce even their own relatives for defeatist attitudes. Social trust eroded, replaced by suspicion and the instinct for self-preservation. At the same time, the government skillfully paired terror with spectacle. Massive rallies at Nuremberg, broadcast over millions of state-subsidized radios, glorified the unity and strength of the national community. Swastika banners fluttered in rhythmic waves. Searchlights pierced the night sky like cathedral spires of light. These displays offered a seductive counterpoint to the violence, presenting a vision of order and destiny that many Germans, battered by years of economic hardship, found strangely reassuring. The regime offered bread jobs and a sense of belonging while quietly demanding moral surrender. For those targeted, the options dwindled. Emigration required bribes, connections, and luck. Families sold heirlooms and lined up at foreign consulates only to face interminable waits and endless paperwork. The United States maintained strict quotas. Britain allowed only limited numbers, primarily children, through the Kinder Transport Program. Palestine, under British mandate, accepted some, but not nearly enough. Each delay was deadly. After 1938, escape routes narrowed month by month until the outbreak of war in 1939 closed most doors entirely. Kristallnacht thus marked the transition from oppression to annihilation. It demonstrated to Nazi leaders that large-scale violence could be carried out with minimal domestic resistance and little international consequence. Within a few short years, policies of forced emigration and segregation would give way to the final solution: the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of other victims across occupied Europe. In hindsight, the Night of Broken Glass was both a culmination and a beginning, the culmination of 5 years of escalating hatred and the beginning of the Holocaust. It revealed the regime's willingness to use terror as policy and the world's reluctance to intervene. Broken windows were only the most visible symbol. What truly shattered that night was any remaining hope that reason or moderation might restrain the Nazi project. After the shattering violence of Kristallnacht, the Nazi regime tightened its grip not only on Jews but on anyone it deemed a threat to its vision of a racially pure Germany. The obsession with biological perfection had long simmered beneath Nazi ideology, and by the late 1930s, it hardened into state policy. The goal was chillingly simple: to engineer a population free of what the regime labeled unwertes Leben, life unworthy of life. The roots of this program stretched back decades. In the early 20th century, eugenics had found intellectual supporters across Europe and even in the United States, where pseudo-scientific theories promised to improve humanity by controlling reproduction. But under Hitler, these ideas became a ruthless instrument of state power. Nazi racial theorists preached that the nation's strength depended on purging hereditary illness and inferior bloodlines. What had once been academic debate became a bureaucratic blueprint for persecution. In July 1933, only months after Hitler seized power, the law for the prevention of genetically diseased offspring was enacted. It authorized compulsory sterilization for people suffering from conditions the regime classified as hereditary schizophrenia, epilepsy, congenital blindness or deafness, even chronic alcoholism. Special hereditary health courts sprang up across Germany. Panels of doctors and judges, often after cursory hearings, decided the fate of individuals brought before them by teachers, social workers, or even neighbors. Appeals were rare and almost always futile. The process could be terrifyingly swift. A midwife might report a child born with a physical deformity. Within weeks, the parents would receive a summons. The hearing lasted minutes. If the court ordered sterilization, the operation was scheduled at a local hospital, sometimes without the patient's informed consent. By 1939, historians estimate that between 300,000 and 400,000 people had been sterilized. Under this law, young women, men barely out of adolescence, children as young as 10, many suffered lifelong physical and psychological scars, their future families erased by a regime obsessed with genetic control. Propaganda made cruelty appear patriotic. Posters calculated the supposed financial burden of the disabled. This hereditarily ill person cost the community 60,000 Reichsmarks over his lifetime fellow citizen. That is your money. In schools, children were taught arithmetic problems that turned human lives into cold equations of cost and efficiency. The message was relentless. Mercy was weakness, and weakness threatened the health of the nation. By the late 1930s, Nazi racial policy advanced from sterilization to murder. In the summer of 1939, just weeks before the invasion of Poland, Hitler secretly authorized a program known as Aktion T4, named for its headquarters at Tiergartenstrasse 4 in Berlin. The plan targeted those with severe physical and mental disabilities, including children born with Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, or other conditions. Doctors, nurses, and administrators, many of them respected professionals, became agents of death. The methods were bureaucratic and chillingly impersonal. Physicians identified patients in hospitals and care homes. Parents were encouraged to bring children to special clinics for evaluation. Buses with windows painted black arrived to transport the chosen to killing centers. Families received polite letters explaining that their loved one had died of pneumonia or heart failure. In reality, victims were injected with lethal overdoses or herded into gas chambers disguised as showers. Historians estimate that at least 70,000 adults and children were murdered in this initial phase. Some scholars place the toll far higher when later secret killings are included. Rumors of these deaths spread quickly despite official secrecy. Smoke from crematoria drifted over nearby villages. Local priests and relatives whispered of the buses and the mysterious brain fever that seemed to strike entire wards at once. A few church leaders, most famously Bishop Clemens August von Galen of Munster, denounced the killings in public sermons, condemning them as murder. His words stirred public unease, and in 1941, the regime officially halted the Central T4 program. But the killing did not stop. It merely shifted to decentralized operations in hospitals and camps, where tens of thousands more perished quietly in the following years. These policies were not hidden from the German people in the way later genocide would be. The eugenics campaign unfolded in plain sight. Neighbors knew when a family's child was taken away for treatment and never returned. Doctors, nurses, midwives, and local officials all played roles, whether through active participation or silent compliance. The regime succeeded not because it completely deceived the public, but because it convinced many that these acts served a higher national good, or because fear made speaking out too dangerous. Beyond the disabled, the concept of unworthy life extended to other groups considered racially or socially inferior. Roma and Sinti communities were targeted for sterilization and later deported to camps where mass killings awaited. Prisoners deemed habitual criminals or asocials, a catch-all category that could include beggars, alcoholics, or simply those who failed to fit into Nazi ideals, were marked for compulsory labor or death. Homosexual men forced to wear the pink triangle in concentration camps were subjected to brutal medical experiments aimed at curing their orientation. Each of these policies shared a single premise that the state had the right to decide who deserved to live. What made the Nazi eugenics program particularly insidious was its veneer of modernity. Officials spoke the language of science and public health, framing sterilization and euthanasia as rational solutions to social problems. Medical journals published articles extolling the benefits of racial hygiene. University lectures taught students to measure skulls and classify eye color as indicators of worth. The white coats of doctors and the sterile halls of hospitals gave the murders a false aura of clinical legitimacy. Ordinary Germans, meanwhile, adjusted to the new reality in ways that revealed the slow erosion of moral boundaries. Some parents, terrified of losing their children, concealed disabilities or moved secretly across provinces. Others, convinced by propaganda or overwhelmed by poverty, signed consent forms, believing they were acting in the child's best interest. Teachers and social workers, many of whom had entered their professions to help the vulnerable, found themselves filling out questionnaires that would become death warrants. Each small decision, each silence helped the machinery function. Internationally, the killings received sporadic attention but little concrete response. Reports filtered to foreign newspapers and church organizations. Yet with Europe hurtling toward war, the plight of Germany's disabled rarely captured sustained global outrage. This absence of outside pressure emboldened the regime, demonstrating again how apathy can serve as an accomplice to atrocity. The logic of eugenics did more than justify murder. It prepared both perpetrators and bystanders for the broader genocidal campaigns to come. By treating human life as a problem of biology and economics, the regime conditioned doctors, bureaucrats, and the public to accept that some lives were expendable. The methods tested in the T4 program, gas chambers disguised as showers, efficient record-keeping mass cremation, would later be applied on a vastly larger scale in the death camps of occupied Poland. Within Germany, the consequences for society were profound. Communities lost not only the individuals killed or sterilized, but also the culture of care and empathy that binds people together. Hospitals became places of dread. The trust between patient and doctor, between parent and nurse, corroded. Even after the war, survivors spoke of the lasting fear that a knock on the door could mean a child's disappearance. By the early 1940s, the Nazi vision of a perfect society had turned science into a weapon and medicine into a tool of state terror. The campaign against the disabled and other so-called unfit was both a horrifying chapter in its own right and a rehearsal for the industrialized mass murder that would soon engulf Europe. When Allied soldiers later liberated concentration camps, they discovered not only the machinery of genocide, but also the long, cold trail that led back to clinics, courtrooms, and university lecture halls in Germany itself. The story of Nazi eugenics is a stark reminder that atrocities can grow from ideas cloaked in reason and respectability. It shows how a modern, educated society, rich with scientists, doctors, and intellectuals, can be seduced into redefining morality until the unthinkable becomes policy. And it warns us that the boundary between care and cruelty, between medicine and murder, is far thinner than most dare to believe. While terror raged against minorities, and the unfit the daily existence of Germans who met the Nazi racial ideal ethnic Germans, without political or religious defects, unfolded in a strange duality of normalcy and quiet coercion. For those who fit the Aryan mold, life could appear stable, even prosperous. The streets were cleaner jobs, more plentiful, and public order far firmer than during the chaotic Weimar years. Yet behind this apparent calm lay a society suffused with fear, surveillance, and relentless indoctrination. A superficial calm. By the late 1930s, German cities bustled with new construction autobahns slicing across the countryside, modern housing blocks rising on urban edges, and gleaming public buildings adorned with swastikas and neoclassical columns. Shops once shuttered by depression reopened their windows filled with radios, clothing, and household goods. At first glance, the promises of the regime seemed to be fulfilled. Unemployment, which had stood near 35% at the height of the Great Depression, dropped dramatically as the government poured resources into rearmament and vast public works projects. Families who had endured years of economic uncertainty now found themselves with regular paychecks. A factory worker in Essen might boast of steady wages. A clerk in Hamburg could once again afford occasional nights out. Holidays to the mountains or the Baltic coast became possible through state-sponsored strength, through joy programs which offered subsidized vacations and cultural outings. These were more than mere perks, they were calculated incentives to foster loyalty and distract citizens from political repression. Conformity as a civic duty, yet prosperity came with conditions. The Nazi concept of the Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community, demanded conformity and ideological alignment. Participation in party-affiliated organizations became a near requirement for social advancement. Civil servants, teachers, and business owners quickly learned that promotions, contracts, or even continued employment often hinged on party membership, or at least visible enthusiasm for the regime. The presence of the swastika was inescapable. Flags fluttered from apartment balconies and government offices. Posters depicting smiling Aryan families and muscular laborers adorned every street corner. Even leisure activities carried the party's stamp. Sports clubs, music societies, and hiking groups were either absorbed into Nazi organizations or dissolved. The message was clear: there was no private sphere beyond the reach of the state. Ordinary Germans adjusted in ways both subtle and profound. People learned to avoid political jokes in cafes, to lower their voices on trams, to praise the Führer in casual conversation. A stray remark could be reported by a neighbor or even one's own child, for the Hitler Youth taught its members that loyalty to the nation superseded loyalty to family. The Gestapo's actual manpower was limited, but the regime relied on a dense web of citizen informants. Fear of denunciation encouraged self-censorship far more effectively than overt surveillance. The fabric of daily life. Still, life went on. Children walked to school through orderly streets lined with flower boxes and freshly painted signs. Housewives shopped in markets where food was abundant compared to the lean Weimar years. Radios, millions of which the government had distributed at low cost, filled kitchens with a steady flow of news music and carefully scripted speeches. For many families, these broadcasts became the soundtrack of daily life. Wagnerian overtures, followed by evening bulletins extolling new economic victories or foreign policy triumphs. Cinema also thrived. Audiences flocked to see comedies, romances, and musicals carefully vetted to avoid political dissent while promoting wholesome German values. While overt propaganda films like Triumph of the Will drew attention, most productions were subtler, reinforcing ideals of sacrifice, obedience, and national pride under the guise of entertainment. A night at the movies offered escape, but it was an escape laced with ideology. Religion presented a more complex picture. Many Protestant churches were brought into the state-sponsored German Christian movement, which sought to align Christianity with Nazi racial theory and portray Jesus as an Aryan hero. Some pastors embraced the arrangement, while others resisted quietly or joined the confessing church, which opposed the Nazification of the faith. Catholic communities navigated a delicate balance with the Vatican's 1933 Concordat, providing nominal protections that the Nazis frequently violated. For devout families, Sunday services continued, but the sermons often carried the weight of caution as clergy measured each word. Gender roles and the ideal family. For women, the Nazi vision of everyday life meant a redefinition of purpose. Propaganda celebrated the virtues of motherhood above all else. Kinder, Küche, Kirche, Children, Kitchen, Church became the guiding motto. The state offered marriage loans and financial incentives for large families, while the Mother's Cross medal honored women who bore 4 or more children. Posters depicted radiant mothers surrounded by blonde-haired offspring, the embodiment of national renewal. Employment opportunities for women narrowed accordingly. Professional careers in law, medicine, or academia were discouraged or outright barred. Instead, women were urged to devote themselves to childbearing and homemaking roles cast as both sacred duty and patriotic service. Yet reality often diverged from propaganda as rearmament accelerated and war approached. Labor shortages forced the government to quietly recruit women back into factories and offices. Still, the official ideal remained the selfless mother nurturing future soldiers. Youth indoctrination. Perhaps no group experienced the regime's reach more intimately than children. From their earliest school days, German youth were immersed in a curriculum infused with racial ideology and militaristic values. Lessons emphasized biology and racial science, teaching students to measure skull shapes and calculate bloodlines. History classes glorified Germanic conquests while demonizing Jews and other supposed enemies. Teachers greeted students with the stiff-armed salute. Pupils were expected to respond in kind. Outside the classroom, the Hitler Youth and its female counterpart, the League of German Girls, became the center of social life. These organizations offered hiking trips, camping adventures, sports competitions, and parades activities that appealed to youthful energy while instilling discipline and obedience. By 1939, membership was effectively compulsory, with more than 90% of German children enrolled. Boys were groomed for military service. Girls were prepared for motherhood and domestic responsibility. The experience bound a generation to the regime long before many could question its ideology. The quiet weight of fear. Despite the outward prosperity and organized routines, an undercurrent of fear ran through everyday interactions. Neighbors weighed every conversation. A careless remark about food shortages or a foreign radio broadcast could prompt a visit from the Gestapo. Workers who complained about factory conditions risked denunciation as defeatists. Even children sensed the danger. Diaries from the era reveal how some kept their thoughts hidden from parents fearing accidental betrayal. Private life shrank to the confines of the trusted household, and even there, trust was not guaranteed. The regime encouraged children to report parents who criticized the government, framing such actions as acts of patriotic duty. Some youngsters swept up in the fervor of Hitler Youth activities did so with zeal. In this way, the state intruded into the most intimate bonds of family and friendship. A society on the brink. By the eve of World War II, the Nazi government had succeeded in weaving its ideology into the fabric of everyday life for the so-called ideal German. To many citizens, the outward signs of prosperity, jobs, order, national pride seemed to validate the regime. Yet these gains were inseparable from the machinery of repression. The clean streets and new highways existed alongside concentration camps and secret police files. The laughter of children at a Hitler Youth campfire mingled with the distant cries of those already deported. For those who conformed daily, life might have felt almost normal, even hopeful. But it was a normalcy built on silence, complicity, and the systematic exclusion of millions. Behind each cheerful rally and every polished storefront lay the unspoken understanding that the same state which provided stability could at any moment destroy those who failed to fit its cruel design. Among all the social roles recast by the Third Reich, none underwent a more deliberate transformation than that of women. To Nazi ideologues, women were the biological cornerstone of the nation, entrusted with the sacred duty of producing and nurturing the next generation of racially pure Germans. While men were groomed for soldiering and conquest, women were called to a different kind of battlefield, the home, the cradle, and the womb. A vision of Aryan motherhood. The party's official slogan for Women Kinder Küche Children Kitchen Church captured the essence of its expectations. Propaganda celebrated the German mother as both saint and soldier, her worth measured not by career or intellect, but by her fertility and devotion to family. Posters and films depicted rosy-cheeked women surrounded by flaxen-haired children beneath swastika banners, presenting motherhood as a patriotic act equal to any feat on the battlefield. This vision was not mere rhetoric. The state enacted sweeping incentives to encourage large families. In 1933, the government introduced interest-free marriage loans of 1,000 Reichsmarks, a significant sum at the time, to newlywed Aryan couples. For each child born, 1/4 of the loan was forgiven, meaning that after 4 children, the debt was entirely erased. The policy sent a powerful signal: motherhood was not only a social expectation, but a financially rewarded national service. In 1938, the regime created the Mother's Cross, Mutterkreuz, a medal awarded in bronze for 4 children, silver for 6, and gold for 8 or more. Public ceremonies honored recipients with pomp, usually reserved for military heroes. Newspapers printed their names. Local party officials congratulated them. For many families struggling to maintain status and respectability, these honors offered a tangible incentive to meet the state's reproductive goals. Curtailing women's independence. While motherhood was glorified, female independence was steadily dismantled. Professional opportunities that had expanded during the Weimar era were rolled back. Women were discouraged and, in many cases, barred from working in law, medicine, or academia. University enrollment for women was capped at 10%. Advertisements and magazines that once celebrated the new woman of the 1920s with her short hair and professional ambitions were replaced by images of demure wives in long dresses cradling infants. This retreat from public life was reinforced by legal restrictions. Married women in the civil service were often forced to resign. Policies barred women from serving as judges or holding senior government posts. Even careers in journalism and the arts became precarious unless they conformed to party ideology. While some women resisted, many acquiesced, encouraged by propaganda that framed domesticity as both honorable and essential to the Reich. Yet the reality was more complex than the official narrative suggested. Economic necessity and later the demands of war drew many women back into the workforce. Women continued to fill jobs in agriculture, small business, and eventually the armaments industry. But these contributions were seldom celebrated. Instead, they were treated as temporary measures, exceptions to the ideal of the stay-at-home mother. Health, fitness, and racial hygiene. Nazi policies for women extended far beyond employment and into intimate aspects of their bodies and relationships. The regime promoted health and athleticism, urging young women to maintain physical fitness to ensure robust offspring. Sports clubs, hiking groups, and compulsory physical education emphasized strength and endurance. Girls in the League of German Girls Bunddeutscher Mädel or BDM engaged in rigorous outdoor activities designed to prepare them for the rigors of childbearing, as much as to foster national pride. The focus on racial hygiene also meant the state intruded into decisions about marriage and sexuality. Couples seeking to wed were required to provide proof of Aryan ancestry and undergo medical examinations to confirm they were free of hereditary disease. Relationships with Jews or other groups deemed racially inferior were criminalized under the Nuremberg laws. Women who defied these rules risked public shaming, imprisonment, or worse. The regime encouraged a form of state-sponsored matchmaking to boost birth rates. Organizations like Lebensborn, founded by Heinrich Himmler, offered maternity homes where racially pure women, often those impregnated by SS officers, could give birth discreetly. These programs blurred the lines between social policy and coercion, treating women's bodies as instruments of demographic strategy. Indoctrination from girlhood. From an early age, German girls were steeped in this ideology. Membership in the League of German Girls became virtually compulsory by the late 1930s. The organization combined wholesome outdoor activities, camping, hiking, folk dancing with relentless political instruction. Girls learned songs praising the Führer, studied racial theory, and heard lectures extolling the virtues of motherhood. Leaders framed marriage and motherhood not as personal choices, but as patriotic duties. Weekend camps reinforced these lessons with a sense of camaraderie and adventure. Around evening campfires, girls pledged themselves to serve the nation by bearing healthy children and supporting their future soldier husbands. For many, the BDM offered friendship and purpose, but it also limited their horizons, channeling their ambitions toward a single destiny. Life behind the propaganda. Despite the regime's relentless messaging, the actual experiences of women varied widely. Urban women in Berlin or Hamburg sometimes chafed against restrictions, finding discreet ways to continue careers or pursue education. Rural women, long accustomed to agricultural labor and large families, often experienced less disruption. Diaries and letters reveal a spectrum of responses from enthusiastic acceptance to quiet resistance. Some women proudly wore their mother's crosses. Others lamented the loss of professional identity or the pressure to have more children than they desired. Economic reality often complicated the ideal. Working-class families needed dual incomes to survive, and many women continued factory or domestic work even as propaganda urged them home. The state tolerated these contradictions so long as outward loyalty was maintained and birth rates rose. War changes everything. With the outbreak of World War II in 1939, the contradictions became impossible to ignore. As men marched off to the front, women were increasingly drafted into roles the regime had once discouraged. They filled positions in munitions plants, offices, and transport networks. The government launched campaigns urging women to contribute to the war economy while still upholding their maternal duties. Posters now depicted women both at factory machines and cradling babies, an uneasy fusion of necessity and ideology. Wartime also brought tragedy. Bombing raids turned mothers into first responders, leading children into shelters and salvaging what remained of shattered homes. Food shortages and rationing demanded ingenuity and endurance. Letters from soldiers at the front often placed emotional burdens on wives and mothers, who were expected to maintain morale and family stability despite fear and loss. The human cost. The Nazi emphasis on motherhood was not merely about birth rates. It also reinforced the brutal racial hierarchy that defined the regime. Women who fit the Aryan ideal were celebrated and rewarded, while those who did not, Jews, Roma, Slavs, the disabled, were stripped of reproductive rights or subjected to sterilization and murder. In this way, the Mother's Cross glittered against a backdrop of coerced abortions, forced sterilizations, and the systematic annihilation of those deemed unworthy. The policies also left lasting personal scars. Some women bore children out of a sense of patriotic obligation rather than personal desire. Others suffered dangerous pregnancies in pursuit of medals or financial incentives. Widows of soldiers killed in battle faced single parenthood under a regime that valued them primarily as producers of future soldiers. After the war, many struggled to reconcile their private sacrifices with the regime's collapse and the revelations of its crimes. Legacy of control. The Nazi redefinition of womanhood offers a stark lesson in how totalitarian states can weaponize gender roles. By elevating motherhood to a civic duty and restricting other avenues of fulfillment, the regime sought to control not just individual lives, but the very future of the population. It fused intimate personal choices, marriage, sex, childbirth into a grand project of racial engineering. Yet, even in this atmosphere of pressure and propaganda, women's experiences remained diverse. Some embraced the role of Aryan mother with fervor. Others quietly defied expectations, pursued careers, or aided resistance efforts. Their stories remind us that even in the tightest web of authoritarian control, personal agency and complexity endure. By the war's end, the image of the heroic German mother stood in stark contrast to the reality of devastation, bombed-out homes, lost sons, and a nation in ruins. The Mother's Cross, once a badge of honor, became a haunting relic of a state that had turned the most private act giving life into an instrument of ideology and oppression. If the Nazi state sought permanence, it knew the surest path ran through its children. Hitler declared, "He alone who owns the youth gains the future," and the regime acted with relentless focus to claim the minds and loyalties of Germany's boys and girls. From the first moments of schooling to the rites of adolescence, the next generation was groomed to see the world through a swastika-shaped lens. The classroom as a crucible. Schools became laboratories of ideology. Traditional subjects, math, literature, geography, were rewritten to serve racial doctrine and militaristic fervor. Biology lessons dwelt obsessively on racial science, instructing children to measure skull shapes and classify eye colors as indicators of worth. History textbooks recast Germany's past as a tale of Aryan triumphs betrayed by Jews, communists, and the November criminals who signed the Treaty of Versailles. Teachers themselves were expected to be both educators and ideological enforcers. By the late 1930s, nearly all had joined the National Socialist Teachers League, an organization requiring loyalty oaths to Hitler. Lessons began and ended with the Nazi salute. Even arithmetic problems served propaganda. If one hereditary cripple cost the state 60,000 Reichsmarks, how many healthy families could be supported for the same amount? To ensure compliance, the regime offered courses that trained teachers in racial theory and political orthodoxy. Those who resisted some out of quiet moral conviction risked dismissal, harassment, or imprisonment. Students absorbed the tension. Diaries and letters from the period reveal youngsters noticing when a teacher's enthusiasm wavered or when a parent cautioned them not to repeat family conversations at school. The Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls. Outside the classroom, the Nazi project of shaping youth found its most powerful vehicle in the Hitler Youth Hitler Jugend and its female counterpart, the League of German Girls Bund Deutscher Mädel, or BDM. What began as voluntary clubs soon became in practice compulsory. By 1939, membership approached 90% of all eligible children. For boys, the Hitler Youth combined the camaraderie of a scout troop with the discipline of a military academy. Weekends were devoted to camping, hiking, marksmanship, and war games that blurred play with preparation for combat. Uniforms of brown shirts and black neckerchiefs gave even 12-year-olds the air of miniature soldiers. Songs around campfires extolled loyalty to the Führer and readiness for sacrifice. Boys learned to march in formation, to read maps, to navigate by compass skills that would translate seamlessly into future service in the Wehrmacht or SS. Girls in the BDM experienced a different but equally regimented path. Their activities included hiking, folk dancing, athletics, and service projects like collecting scrap metal or helping on farms. Beneath the wholesome surface, the program trained them for domestic roles. Instruction in housekeeping, childcare, and racial hygiene emphasized their destiny as mothers of Aryan children. Leaders spoke of childbirth as a patriotic duty and praised large families as Germany's greatest weapon. Many adolescents embraced these organizations enthusiastically. They offered adventure, friendship, and a sense of purpose in a country recovering from economic despair. For rural youth, BDM and Hitler Youth camps provided rare opportunities to travel. For city kids, the uniforms and rituals created a powerful sense of belonging. Some later recalled the thrill of feeling part of something larger than themselves, proof of how seductive collective identity can be even when laced with hate. Youth as instruments of the state. The regime did not hesitate to exploit that enthusiasm. Hitler Youth leaders encouraged members to place loyalty to the nation above loyalty to family. Children were urged to report parents or neighbors who criticized the government. In one notorious case, a boy named Herbert Norkus became a propaganda martyr after he was killed in a street fight with communists. His story was used to inspire thousands to see themselves as soldiers in an ideological war. The pressure to conform was intense. Families who resisted risked social isolation fines, or worse. Parents who tried to keep children out of the organizations found themselves harassed by local party officials or denounced by neighbors. Even when membership was technically optional, the practical reality made refusal nearly impossible. A child without a Hitler Youth uniform might be ostracized at school or denied access to certain training opportunities. The state also wove itself into rites of passage. Birthday greetings from Hitler were common for children of loyal families. Special ceremonies marked the transition from childhood to adolescence, where youngsters swore oaths to the Führer under banners of red and black. These rituals combined the excitement of personal milestones with the gravity of political allegiance, fusing identity with ideology, cultivating a warrior ethos. Physical fitness was exalted as both recreation and preparation for war. Gymnastics, track and field events, and endurance hikes hardened bodies for the military campaigns the regime was already planning. Boys competed for badges in marksmanship and survival skills. Girls trained in long-distance marches and calisthenics to strengthen their bodies for future motherhood. Medical examinations and health tests reinforced the obsession with racial purity and physical perfection. As Germany marched toward conflict, the Hitler Youth became an auxiliary military force. Older members received training in weapons handling and map reading. Some were later mobilized for anti-aircraft duty or courier work. By the final years of World War II, boys as young as 16 were fighting on the front lines, a grim culmination of years of militarized play, entertainment, and propaganda. The state understood that indoctrination worked best when wrapped in enjoyment. Film, radio, and popular literature saturated youth culture. Children's magazines carried serialized adventure stories of brave Aryan heroes battling sinister foreign villains. Radio programs mixed music with ideological messages. Films such as Hitler Junge Quecks portrayed loyalty to the party as the highest virtue, often with tragic but glorified sacrifices. Even seemingly apolitical activities were infused with propaganda. Art classes depicted heroic workers and soldiers. Music instruction favored patriotic songs. Holidays like Christmas were stripped of Christian themes and reimagined as celebrations of Germanic heritage and racial destiny, with solstice fires and pagan symbolism replacing nativity scenes. Quiet resistance. Despite the regime's vast machinery, not all youth succumbed. Groups like the Edelweiss Pirates, the Swing Youth, and the White Rose defied Nazi expectations in small but significant ways. The Edelweiss Pirates rejected the regimentation of the Hitler Youth, favoring jazz music hiking trips without supervision and anti-Nazi graffiti. The Swing Youth embraced American jazz and British fashion, subtly mocking the regime's cultural dictates. Most famously, the White Rose group, led by university students Hans and Sophie Scholl, distributed leaflets condemning Nazi crimes and calling for resistance. Their courage came at a terrible cost. Arrested in 1943, they were executed by guillotine. Such acts were rare and dangerous, but they proved that even under relentless pressure, young people could recognize injustice and act on conscience. Lasting imprint. By the outbreak of war in 1939, the Nazi project of youth indoctrination had achieved much of what it intended. An entire generation had been raised in an environment where devotion to Hitler was as natural as morning prayers, where racism was presented as scientific fact, and where militarism was woven into play. The results were evident as the war ground on teenagers volunteered eagerly for service. 12-year-olds manned anti-aircraft guns during Allied bombings. Hitler Youth units fought with fanatical resolve in the dying days of the Third Reich. Yet the indoctrination was not absolute. After the war, many young Germans described a jarring awakening as they confronted the collapse of the ideology that had shaped their childhood. Some wrestled with guilt over betrayals of neighbors, of parents, of friends they had once believed were acts of patriotism. Others struggled simply to imagine a life not defined by uniforms and salutes. The Nazi campaign to mold its youth remains one of history's starkest examples of how a totalitarian regime can manipulate education, entertainment, and social ritual to capture the minds of the young. It was not only a strategy for maintaining power in the present, but a calculated investment in the future, a bid to ensure that the ideals of the Third Reich would outlive the generation that created it. Religion in Germany entered the Nazi era with deep roots and rich diversity. 2/3 of the population identified as Protestant, mostly Lutheran, while about 1/3 were Roman Catholic. Smaller communities of Jews, Orthodox Christians, and Free Church Protestants added to the tapestry. But once Hitler secured power, these centuries-old traditions faced an authoritarian state determined to bend faith to its will or to sideline it entirely. Early calculations and the Vatican Concordat. Hitler understood that outright war with religion could alienate millions. In 1933, the regime negotiated a concordat with the Vatican, promising to respect Catholic institutions and allow the Church to manage its schools and charities. For the Holy See, still wary after the anti-clericalism of World War I and the Weimar years, the agreement seemed a pragmatic safeguard. But it quickly became clear that the Nazis saw the Concordat not as a contract of mutual respect, but as a tactical pause. Almost immediately, Catholic youth groups were dissolved, church publications censored, and priests arrested on dubious charges of currency smuggling or immorality. By the late 1930s, hundreds of clergy languished in concentration camps, such as Dachau, which eventually held over 500 Catholic priests. Sunday sermons often became acts of quiet defiance as priests tiptoed between spiritual guidance and subtle critique of Nazi brutality. Positive Christianity and the German Christian movement. For the Protestant majority, the regime pushed a different strategy: co-optation. Joseph Goebbels and other party ideologues championed positive Christianity, a vaguely defined faith stripped of what the Nazis derided as Jewish influences. Jesus was reimagined as a heroic Aryan warrior battling Jewish corruption. The Old Testament, with its Hebrew patriarchs and prophets, was downplayed or rejected outright. This theology found a home in the German Christian movement, a faction within the evangelical church that embraced Nazi racial ideology and sought to fuse it with Protestant worship. Congregations were urged to display the swastika alongside the cross and to begin services with the Hitler salute. Hymns praising the Führer entered some church songbooks. In 1933, the movement's leader Ludwig Müller was appointed Reich bishop, charged with unifying Germany's regional Protestant churches into a single state-controlled Reich church. Not all believers accepted this Nazified Christianity. A rival faction known as the Confessing Church, led by theologians like Martin Niemöller and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, rejected state interference and insisted on the authority of Scripture alone. Their Declaration of Independence in the 1934 Barmen Confession proclaimed Jesus Christ is the one Word of God, a direct challenge to Nazi attempts to elevate Hitler as a quasi-divine figure. Members of the Confessing Church faced harassment, surveillance, and imprisonment. Bonhoeffer would later be executed for his involvement in resistance efforts. Suppressing dissent and spiritual autonomy. Across denominations, the Nazi government sought to hollow out religious life. Church schools were pressured to close or replace religious instruction with racial science. Religious youth groups were folded into the Hitler Youth, and pastors were required to join state-monitored associations. Clergy who criticized the regime risked denunciation and arrest. Even private Bible study gatherings could draw suspicion. The Gestapo infiltrated seminaries and monitored sermons, creating an atmosphere of constant tension. Parishioners sometimes found themselves questioned after services if a priest or pastor's words seemed subversive. Some ministers learned to craft sermons layered with double meaning, harmless on the surface, but offering comfort and quiet resistance to those attuned. Ordinary believers navigated a landscape of compromise and quiet courage. Many continued to attend church, baptize children, and celebrate sacraments, clinging to rituals that affirmed a realm of life beyond politics. Others, intimidated or seduced by the regime's pageantry, drifted into the German Christian orbit, or allowed their faith to wither in the glare of propaganda, pagan symbols, and the cult of the Führer. While manipulating established churches, the Nazi leadership also flirted with neo-pagan and occult ideas that exalted ancient Germanic traditions. Heinrich Himmler, in particular, romanticized pre-Christian folklore, commissioning SS rituals drawn from Nordic myth and staging solstice ceremonies illuminated by torchlight. Party rallies often borrowed the aesthetic of sacred festivals. Massive columns of searchlights created a cathedral of light, and oaths to Hitler carried a quasi-religious fervor. The regime's ultimate spiritual aim was not to honor Christ or Odin, but to center worship on the state and the Führer. Hitler's birthday became a national holiday. Portraits of him occupied spaces once reserved for crucifixes. Children learned hymns to Hitler's glory as naturally as traditional carols. In this way, the Nazi government sought to replace centuries of diverse faith with a civil religion of blood, soil, and leader. Acts of conscience. Despite pervasive pressure, acts of resistance persisted. Bishop Clemens August von Galen of Munster delivered fiery 1941 sermons condemning the euthanasia program that murdered the disabled, declaring it a violation of divine law. His words spread quickly, printed in clandestine leaflets and whispered from pulpit to pulpit. Public outrage forced the regime to halt the centrally organized T4 killings, at least officially proving that courageous speech could still shake the system. Other clergy sheltered Jews or helped them escape, often at great personal risk. Protestant pastor Heinrich Gruber established an underground network to aid those targeted by the Nuremberg laws, while Catholic convents quietly hid Jewish children within their walls. These efforts saved lives but invited severe reprisals. Many rescuers were arrested, deported, or executed. Faith amid war and ruin. As World War II dragged on and Allied bombs reduced cities to rubble, churches became both refugees and targets. Cathedral spires collapsed under firestorms, yet congregations gathered amid ruins to pray for survival and peace. For many Germans, these moments rekindled a spirituality deeper than propaganda, a reminder of a moral order beyond the Reich. Soldiers on the Eastern Front carried pocket New Testaments or small crosses alongside military gear, seeking comfort in a faith their leaders sought to control. Letters home reveal prayers for protection, expressions of doubt, and the enduring hope of divine mercy. Even in the heart of a regime bent on deifying itself, the human search for transcendence persisted. Aftermath and reckoning. When the Third Reich fell, Germany's churches faced a painful reckoning. Some clergy and lay people had shown remarkable courage, but many institutions had accommodated or even abetted the regime. The confessing church's resistance was celebrated, yet it represented only a fraction of Protestant congregations. Catholic leaders grappled with their cautious diplomacy and failures to speak out more forcefully. Post-war theologians like Karl Barth and Catholic thinkers such as Romano Guardini urged a deep examination of how fear, nationalism, and opportunism had distorted the gospel. For survivors and returning soldiers, churches offered solace but also provoked questions. How had a nation so deeply Christian allowed such evil to flourish? How had pulpits gone silent while neighbors disappeared? These questions shaped post-war German theology and remain part of the country's moral memory. The story of faith under the swastika is not one of simple victimhood or heroic defiance, but of a complex struggle in which millions of ordinary believers navigated coercion, temptation, and conscience. Some capitulated, some resisted, many simply tried to endure. In the end, the Nazi attempt to replace God with Führer and to bend eternal truths to racial myth failed, but only after immense human cost. If the Nazi state ruled by fear, it also ruled by story. Adolf Hitler and his inner circle understood that controlling information was as vital as controlling armies. To win hearts and minds, they built a propaganda machine unprecedented in its scale and sophistication, one that wrapped politics in spectacle and turned ideology into everyday experience. Joseph Goebbels, architect of influence. At the center stood Joseph Goebbels, minister of propaganda and public enlightenment. Brilliant, ruthless, and tireless, Goebbels believed propaganda must do more than inform. It must captivate. It is not enough to inform people, he declared, you must immerse them in it. Under his direction, newspapers, films, radio, literature, theater, and even art exhibitions became instruments of the state. Goebbels centralized control of the press, requiring editors to join the Nazi Editors Association and attend daily briefings where they received official storylines and forbidden topics. Independent journalism vanished. Newspapers that had once carried diverse political opinions became mouthpieces for the regime, filled with triumphalist headlines, lurid anti-Semitic caricatures, and endless praise of the Führer. The power of the radio. Perhaps the most potent tool was the radio, dubbed the People's Receiver, Volksempfänger. Goebbels subsidized production so that millions of German households could afford a set priced as low as a few Reichsmarks. By 1939, more than 70% of homes owned one. Crucially, these inexpensive models were designed to receive only local frequencies, making foreign broadcasts difficult. Through these radios, Hitler's speeches thundered into living rooms, beer halls, and factory floors. Families gathered to hear his voice, often broadcast simultaneously across the Reich. Music programs alternated with news bulletins extolling economic recovery or military victories. Even the casual listener absorbed a steady rhythm of pride, fear, and obedience. The intimacy of the human voice carried an emotional charge that print could never match. Public listening was equally important. Loudspeakers blared in marketplaces and town squares, ensuring that even those without a receiver were enveloped in the official narrative. During key addresses, traffic halted as crowds assembled to hear the Führer. These shared experiences fused personal emotion with collective identity. Film as spectacle. Cinema, a relatively young art form, became another weapon. Goebbels personally oversaw the film industry commissioning works that ranged from overt propaganda like Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will to seemingly innocuous entertainment laced with ideological cues. Riefenstahl's documentaries transformed Nazi rallies into mesmerizing epics of unity and power. Sweeping camera movements, monumental architecture, and precise choreography turned politics into a kind of religion. Audiences across Europe, even beyond Germany, marveled at the artistry, sometimes forgetting the purpose to glorify a regime bent on conquest and exclusion. Not every film shouted its message. Romantic comedies and melodramas often carried subtle themes of sacrifice for the Volk or warnings about racial mixing. Anti-Semitic films like Judd Suss and The Eternal Jew portrayed Jews as corrupt and dangerous, preparing the public for the violence that followed. These productions blurred entertainment with indoctrination, making ideology feel natural and inevitable. Pageantry and the Cathedral of Light. Beyond media, the Nazis mastered live spectacle. The Nuremberg rallies, staged annually from 1933 to 1938, were vast theaters of power. Hundreds of thousands of uniformed party members marched in perfect synchrony as gigantic swastika banners rippled in the wind. At night, searchlights aimed skyward created what architect Albert Speer called the Cathedral of Light, a luminous colonnade that seemed to fuse earthly politics with cosmic destiny. These rallies were carefully choreographed emotional experiences, speeches built from quiet solemnity to thunderous crescendos. Mass singing created a visceral sense of unity. Participants described feelings of awe, even transcendence, as if swept into a force larger than themselves. For many, these gatherings transformed political allegiance into near religious devotion. Smaller spectacles reinforced the message year-round. Torchlight parades illuminated city streets. May Day celebrations, once associated with labor movements, were recast as festivals of national solidarity. Even sporting events carried ideological weight. The 1936 Berlin Olympics showcased a seemingly revitalized Germany while masking persecution at home. Stadiums draped in swastikas and choreographed crowds presented the world with an image of discipline and vigor. Print and visual propaganda. Printed materials saturated daily life. Posters in bright reds and blacks urged citizens to buy war bonds, produce more children, or boycott Jewish businesses. Children's books depicted sinister caricatures of Jews alongside heroic blonde protagonists. School primers combined alphabet lessons with slogans like F is for Führer. Magazines such as Signal reached international audiences, combining striking photography with articles praising German culture and military prowess. Cartoons and caricatures dehumanized enemies. Jews, Bolsheviks, Allied leaders making violence against them seemed justified. These images were simple, memorable, and inescapable, turning sidewalks, tram stops, and shop windows into billboards of ideology. Everyday immersion. What made Nazi propaganda uniquely powerful was its totality. It was not confined to special events or official broadcasts. It permeated the mundane. Citizens encountered it in postage stamps, film trailers before a romantic comedy, the lyrics of a popular song, even in architecture that celebrated pure German forms. Children recited party slogans in morning exercises. Workers heard patriotic music piped through factory loudspeakers. The line between public and private blurred until propaganda became the ambient noise of life. Importantly, the regime understood that persuasion required both the carrot and the stick. Propaganda enticed with promises of unity and strength, while censorship ensured no competing narrative could gain traction. Foreign radio broadcasts were outlawed, and violators risked prison or even execution. Books by Jewish socialist or pacifist authors were burned in public bonfires, their flames lighting the night sky as students cheered. The 1933 book burnings sent a message as clear as any speech: alternative ideas would be incinerated. Subtle resistance and private doubt. Despite the regime's dominance, not all Germans accepted the propaganda uncritically. Some tuned secretly to the BBC or other foreign stations, risking severe punishment to hear uncensored news. Underground networks shared banned literature, from political pamphlets to classic novels deemed degenerate. Intellectuals and artists sometimes encoded dissent in allegorical plays or abstract art, though discovery could mean ruin. Ordinary citizens developed quiet coping strategies. A raised eyebrow during a bombastic radio address, a whispered joke about Goebbels, a hidden photograph of a Jewish friend. These small acts signaled inner distance from the official line. While such gestures rarely coalesced into organized resistance, they revealed that propaganda, however pervasive, never fully erased individual judgment. War and the tightening grip. With the outbreak of World War II, propaganda turned more overtly to sustaining morale and justifying conquest. Newsreels celebrated rapid victories in Poland and France, portraying the Wehrmacht as invincible. As the war dragged on and casualties mounted, Goebbels shifted tactics, portraying the conflict as a defensive struggle against world Jewry and Bolshevism. After the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad, he delivered his infamous total war speech in Berlin's Sportpalast, rallying the population to sacrifice everything for survival. Even in the final months of 1945, as Allied bombs reduced cities to rubble, the propaganda machine churned out fantasies of secret weapons and imminent victory. Radio announcers urged civilians to fight on, promising miracles that never came. The disconnect between official rhetoric and lived reality grew glaring, but by then, the machinery of repression ensured few could voice their disillusionment. Legacy of manipulation. The Nazi propaganda system stands as a case study in how a modern state can exploit technology, art, and psychology to control a population. It relied not only on lies, but on emotional truths, fear of chaos, longing for community pride, and heritage that resonated with many Germans. By weaving ideology into entertainment and daily routine, the regime blurred the boundary between fact and fantasy, making participation feel both thrilling and inevitable. When the Third Reich collapsed, the shattered remains of this propaganda empire lingered in memory. Post-war denazification efforts banned Nazi symbols and purged school curricula, but the challenge of unlearning years of indoctrination proved immense. Survivors recalled how easily they had been swept along, not always by force but by spectacle, belonging, and the subtle seduction of a story repeated until it felt like truth. The lesson endures: propaganda thrives not merely on censorship or deception, but on its ability to make people feel they are part of something grand. In Nazi Germany, that grand vision masked a descent into barbarity, proving that when words and images are wielded as weapons, they can be as deadly as any army. Having bound the press, churches, and schools to its will, the Nazi regime turned with equal determination to the workplace and the very structure of everyday labor. Behind the facade of rising employment and gleaming autobahns lay a vast social experiment to reshape Germans into a disciplined, militarized workforce, whose ultimate purpose was to feed the war machine. Reforging the economy. When Hitler took power in 1933, Germany was still staggering from the Great Depression. Factories stood idle and millions were unemployed. The Nazis seized this crisis as an opportunity to tether economic recovery to ideological loyalty. Trade unions were abolished within months, replaced by the German labor front, Deutsche Arbeitsfront, or DAF. This state-run organization absorbed more than 20 million workers and employers, eliminating strikes and collective bargaining. Officially, the DAF claimed to represent both labor and management, but in reality, it served the regime, ensuring that industry met the needs of rearmament and that workers remained compliant. Membership was technically voluntary, yet essential for employment. The DAF dictated wage agreements, oversaw working conditions, and flooded factories with propaganda. Its strength through Joykraft, Durchfreude KDF program offered subsidized vacations, theater tickets, and even cruises perks designed to buy goodwill while discouraging dissent. Through these incentives, the regime wove ideological loyalty into the fabric of leisure itself. Massive public works projects furthered both economic and political goals. The construction of the Autobahn, heralded as a symbol of modern efficiency, provided thousands of jobs and showcased Germany's engineering prowess. Dams, canals, and housing developments followed, all doubling as preparations for future military mobilization. Official statistics trumpeted dramatic reductions in unemployment, though these figures excluded Jews, women forced from jobs, and men conscripted into labor or the military. The Reich Labor Service. Central to the Nazi plan for social engineering was the Reichsarbeitsdienst RAD, or Reich Labor Service. Established in 1935, the RAD required all young men and later young women to serve a 6-month term of compulsory labor before other employment or military duty. For men, the RAD was a paramilitary experience. Recruits wore brown and gray uniforms, lived in barracks, and performed physically demanding tasks, draining marshes, building roads, clearing forests. Days began with roll call and flag-raising ceremonies, continued with strenuous work, and ended with lectures extolling Nazi ideals. The service aimed not merely to build infrastructure, but to instill discipline, camaraderie, and unquestioning obedience. Women's service focused on agricultural and domestic labor. Young women were dispatched to farms, hospitals, or child care centers where they performed tasks framed as contributions to the people's community. Official rhetoric celebrated these duties as patriotic, reinforcing the regime's gender ideology. Men prepared for soldiering, women for motherhood and support roles. The RAD symbolized the Nazi vision of uniting all Germans in service to the nation. It blurred the line between civilian and soldier, making labor itself an instrument of militarization. By forcing diverse youth from urban clerks to rural peasants into shared, regimented experiences, the state hoped to dissolve class divisions and bind individuals to a collective destiny. Compulsory military service. In March 1935, barely 2 years after taking power, Hitler openly defied the Treaty of Versailles by reintroducing conscription. All able-bodied men were required to serve in the Wehrmacht for at least 2 years, a measure celebrated by many Germans as a return to national dignity. Military service became a rite of passage, completing the ideological grooming that began in Hitler youth camps and RAD barracks. The army itself became a crucible of indoctrination. Training emphasized not only tactics and discipline, but also loyalty to the Führer and contempt for perceived enemies. Soldiers swore personal oaths to Hitler rather than to the Constitution or the nation, a symbolic shift that placed allegiance to one man above all law. For families, conscription brought both pride and anxiety. Parents boasted of sons in uniform, but letters from the front soon carried the weariness of endless drills and the foreboding of coming conflict. The steady rhythm of call-ups altered village life. Young men vanished from farms and factories, replaced by foreign laborers or women pressed into roles once reserved for men. The Volkswagen dream and the promise of prosperity. Alongside these mandates, the regime cultivated popular enthusiasm with projects like the Volkswagen or People's Car. Announced in 1938, the plan promised an affordable automobile for every family, symbolizing technological progress and national pride. Workers could participate by contributing small weekly payments to a savings plan. Millions eagerly joined imagining weekend drives on the new autobahns. The reality was less idyllic. No private citizen received a car before the war. Factories were quickly repurposed for military production. Yet the program served its purpose as propaganda, reinforcing the idea that collective effort and loyalty would yield personal rewards eventually. The social contract of control. Through these measures, the Nazi state crafted a new social contract. The government provided jobs, leisure opportunities, and the promise of national renewal, and citizens in turn surrendered independence. Dissent was not merely dangerous, it became socially unthinkable. Workers who complained risked denunciation as work-shy or defeatist labels that could lead to dismissal, blacklisting, or imprisonment in a concentration camp. The Gestapo maintained a network of informants in factories and offices, but much surveillance came from fellow citizens. A co-worker's casual remark, a neighbor's suspicion of listening to foreign radio could bring investigation. Fear of denunciation fostered self-censorship, ensuring that the state's control extended beyond official decrees. Women in the wartime workforce. Despite its ideal of women as homemakers, the regime increasingly relied on female labor as war approached. By the late 1930s, industries from munitions to agriculture faced acute labor shortages. Propaganda that once urged women back to the kitchen now called them to factories, offices, and fields. Posters depicted strong, smiling women riveting aircraft parts or driving tractors, an abrupt but pragmatic shift. This contradiction exposed the regime's flexibility when necessity demanded. While still extolling motherhood as the highest duty, the state quietly acknowledged that victory required every pair of capable hands. Millions of women answered the call, juggling long shifts with household responsibilities and enduring the hazards of bombing raids on industrial centers. Foreign and forced labor. As war expanded, Germany turned to foreign labor to sustain its economy and war effort. By 1944, over 7 million foreign workers and prisoners of war toiled in German factories, farms, and construction sites. Many were coerced or outright enslaved, housed in brutal conditions, and subjected to harsh discipline. Polish and Soviet civilians suffered especially grim fates. Deprived of legal rights, they endured starvation rations, beatings, and exposure to the elements. Some were forced to wear identifying badges, P for Poles, OST for Eastern workers, marking them as second-class humans in the racial hierarchy. Their exploitation underscores how the regime's economic achievements rested on systemic violence and dehumanization. Everyday life in the militarized economy. For ordinary Germans, these policies meant a life increasingly shaped by the rhythms of labor and war. Factory whistles replaced church bells as the dominant soundscape. Ration cards and work permits became as essential as identity papers. Leisure activities from sports to vacations were organized through state programs that reinforced collective identity. Even moments of relaxation carried the implicit message your time, like your work, belongs to the Reich. Yet many citizens found genuine satisfaction in this new order. After the desperation of the Depression, steady employment and social programs felt like deliverance. Diaries from the era capture a mix of relief and unease, relief at economic stability, unease at the ever-present demands for conformity. The same Autobahn that promised weekend outings also carried troop convoys eastward. The factory producing household goods one year might produce munitions the next. Toward total war. By the time Germany plunged into full-scale conflict in 1939, the groundwork for total war was complete. Years of compulsory labor service conscription and centralized economic control had forged a society where individual effort served a single purpose: the expansion and survival of the Nazi state. Citizens were not merely subjects, but cogs in a meticulously organized machine, their daily routines synchronized to the ambitions of the regime. As Allied bombs later rained down and shortages bit deep, this system would reveal its dark efficiency. Workers toiled longer hours under stricter supervision. Youths barely out of school manned anti-aircraft guns or filled factory shifts left vacant by men at the front. The promise of a people's community gave way to a reality of exhaustion and fear, but the habits of discipline and obedience ingrained over years kept the machinery running until the very end. The Nazi transformation of labor and conscription demonstrates how economic revival can mask authoritarian control. Jobs and public works projects offered stability and pride, yet they were inseparable from militarization and exploitation. Beneath the image of a nation reborn stood a workforce regimented for conquest, a society where work like speech and thought belonged first and last to the state. When Adolf Hitler addressed the German people about economic revival, he spoke not just of bread and jobs, but of dignity and destiny. To a nation battered by the Great Depression, his promises of full employment and national renewal were electrifying. The economic policies that followed would indeed transform Germany's fortunes, yet they also masked a calculated drive toward rearmament and war. From crisis to command economy. In early 1933, unemployment hovered near 6 million, roughly 1 in 3 workers. Inflation and currency instability had eroded savings, and the Weimar government seemed paralyzed. Hitler's regime moved quickly to project an image of decisive action. Public works programs, canals, railroads, and most famously the Autobahn began within months. These projects were trumpeted as evidence of national resurgence. Photographs of workers breaking ground for new highways filled newspapers while posters proclaimed "work and bread." Yet the numbers told a more complex story. Unemployment fell dramatically, but partly because women, Jews, and political opponents were forced from jobs and excluded from statistics. Moreover, the massive spending was less about civilian needs than about preparing for conflict. Highways doubled as military transport routes. Factories making construction steel could quickly pivot to arms production. The 4-year plan and rearmament. By 1936, the regime formalized its priorities in the 4-year plan, overseen by Hermann Göring. Its goal was to make Germany self-sufficient in key raw materials and ready for war within 4 years. Investments flowed into synthetic fuel and rubber while rearmament accelerated. Aircraft factories, shipyards, and munitions plants expanded at breakneck speed. The plan created jobs and stimulated industry, but it strained resources and required strict control of wages and prices. Rationing of certain goods began even before the war. The government encouraged saving through Reich labor treasury bonds and restricted imports to conserve foreign currency. These measures gave the illusion of stability while channeling nearly every economic gain toward the military. People's community through consumption. While preparing for war, the regime understood the power of consumer aspiration. To maintain public enthusiasm, it offered glimpses of prosperity within reach of the average worker. The most famous symbol was the Volkswagen, literally, the people's car. Announced in 1938, the project promised every German family an affordable automobile, a modern marvel designed by engineer Ferdinand Porsche. Through the strength, through joy. Kraft Dirk Freude KDF program, workers could join a savings plan, 5 Reichsmarks a week would eventually secure a shiny new car. Posters showed happy families motoring along the new Autobahns, a vision of modern comfort and freedom. The scheme captured the public imagination. Hundreds of thousands enrolled, proudly displaying their savings stamps. But the dream was largely illusory. Not a single Volkswagen reached a private buyer before the war. The new Wolfsburg factory quickly shifted to producing military vehicles like the Kubelwagen and amphibious Schwimmwagen. Workers who had scrimped for years to buy a car found their savings evaporated in the war economy. Yet the propaganda value was immense. The promise itself strengthened the regime's image as a provider. Strength through joy and the leisure state. The KDF program extended far beyond cars. It organized affordable vacations, cruises, and cultural outings for millions of workers, many of whom had never before traveled or attended theater performances. Giant resort complexes such as the sprawling seaside facility at Prora on the Baltic Sea were planned to host thousands of vacationing families at once. These experiences were not merely perks, they were tools of loyalty and distraction. Every trip, every concert ticket carried the message that the Nazi state cared for the common worker. Excursions featured patriotic songs and lectures, and travelers were surrounded by symbols of the party. Leisure became another arena where politics and daily life fused seamlessly. Farmers and the Reich food estate. The rural economy received special attention. Through the Reich food estate led by Richard Walther Darré, the government aimed to stabilize prices and glorify the peasantry as the racial backbone of the nation. The blood and soil ideology romanticized small farms as the cradle of Aryan purity. Policies guaranteed minimum prices for crops, restricted farm sales to prevent debt-driven consolidation, and required farmers to join local agricultural cooperatives. While these measures initially improved stability, they also imposed strict quotas and controls. Farmers were told what to grow and how much, while shortages of fertilizer and equipment caused hidden strain. Many rural families welcomed the security, but chafed under bureaucratic oversight. Financing the illusion. Behind the scenes, the economic revival relied on creative and dangerous financing. The regime issued MEFO bills, essentially promissory notes used to fund rearmament without immediate impact on the national budget. This concealed massive deficit spending from the public and foreign observers. Tax policy shifted to favor heavy industry and military suppliers, rewarding those who aligned with the regime's goals. Foreign trade remained a vulnerability. Lacking domestic sources for oil, rubber, and key metals, Germany depended on imports from countries like Romania and the Soviet Union. Autarky, economic self-sufficiency, was never fully achieved. This dependence partly drove Hitler's expansionist ambitions as he sought to seize resource-rich territories in Eastern Europe. Social engineering through work. Economic policy was inseparable from social control. With independent trade unions outlawed, the German Labor Front regulated wages, mediated disputes, and flooded workplaces with Nazi symbolism. Strikes were virtually eliminated, replaced by labor trustees who enforced discipline and ideological conformity. Work itself became an act of loyalty to the state. The regime celebrated the dignity of labor while demanding absolute obedience. Workers were honored as vital to the national mission, yet their bargaining power vanished. Propaganda posters depicted smiling laborers building autobahns or forging steel beneath slogans like "Work is freedom," a phrase that would later mockingly appear over concentration camp gates. War economy and forced labor. Once war began in 1939, the economy shifted fully to military production. Civilian goods grew scarce, rationing expanded to food, clothing, and fuel. To meet the insatiable demand for manpower, the regime turned to conquered territories. By 1944, an estimated 7 million foreign laborers and prisoners of war toiled in German factories, farms, and mines. Many were subjected to brutal conditions, starvation rations, and violent discipline. Their exploitation propped up an economy straining under Allied bombing and frontline losses. Jews and other persecuted groups were forced into slave labor under horrific circumstances, often in armaments, production, or camp construction. The economic gains of wartime Germany were inseparable from the suffering of millions compelled to work at the point of a gun. Public perception in the good times. For many ethnic Germans, especially in the pre-war years, these policies seemed to deliver on promises of prosperity. Diaries from the late 1930s describe families affording small luxuries New radios, bicycles, even vacations after years of deprivation. National pride swelled as unemployment plummeted and gleaming autobahns stretched across the countryside. Yet, even among beneficiaries, unease lingered. Some sensed that the boom was brittle, dependent on armaments and debt. Others quietly questioned the morality of policies that excluded neighbors and relied on intimidation. Still, the lure of stability and the spectacle of national renewal proved powerful enough to quiet most doubts. Illusion of stability. Reality of war. By the eve of World War II, Hitler could boast of an economy that seemed revitalized and a population that largely believed in the regime's competence. But the foundation was fragile. Heavy borrowing, dependence on foreign resources, and an unsustainable military buildup. The economic miracle was not a triumph of wise policy, but a prelude to aggression. Expansion into Austria, Czechoslovakia, and eventually Poland promised the resources needed to keep the system afloat. The Volkswagen that never arrived, the vacations, shadowed by marching songs, the highways designed for tanks as much as tourists, all revealed the true nature of Nazi economic policy. It was not about shared prosperity or modern comfort. It was about preparing a nation for endless war while keeping its citizens dazzled and compliant. As Allied bombs later reduced those autobahns to rubble and the Wolfsburg plant to twisted steel, the people's car and the glittering promises of the 1930s stood exposed as propaganda. The prosperity that had won hearts was never meant to last. It was from the start a carefully constructed mirage on the road to global conflict. By the late 1930s, the shimmering facade of prosperity and unity that the Nazi regime had so carefully constructed began revealing its true purpose, preparing Germany for conquest. Economic revival, youth indoctrination, and the remilitarization of society all pointed toward a single objective: expansion through war. For Hitler and his inner circle, peace was never more than a temporary tactic. The road to aggression. Germany's first bold moves tested the fragile post-World War I order. In 1936, Hitler sent troops into the demilitarized Rhineland, violating the Treaty of Versailles. The gamble paid off. France and Britain, wary of another war, offered only protests. Emboldened, Hitler turned to Austria. In March 1938, German forces crossed the border in the Anschluss, greeted by cheering crowds. Soon after, the regime orchestrated the annexation of the Sudetenland, a largely German-speaking region of Czechoslovakia, through the 1938 Munich Agreement. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain famously proclaimed peace for our time, unaware that Hitler already planned to seize the rest of Czechoslovakia, which he did the following March. Each success fed a narrative of destiny and invincibility. Nazi propaganda celebrated these conquests as the natural reunification of the German people and the first step toward reclaiming living space, Lebensraum, in Eastern Europe. At mass rallies, Hitler promised that the Reich would last 1,000 years. Few outside Germany realized that these triumphs were rehearsals for a much larger war. The invasion of Poland. On September 1st, 1939, German forces stormed into Poland, unleashing the Blitzkrieg lightning war. Waves of bombers struck railways and cities, while fast-moving tanks and infantry encircled enemy forces. The assault was brutal and swift, overwhelming Polish defenses in weeks. Britain and France, finally recognizing Hitler's ambitions, declared war on Germany 2 days later. World War II had begun. The invasion was not merely military, it introduced the world to the calculated terror that would define Nazi occupation. Special SS units, the Einsatzgruppen, followed the army, executing Polish elites, clergy, and Jews in mass shootings. Villages were torched and civilians faced deportation, forced labor, or death. For occupied Poland, the war began with annihilation, early victories, and expanding fronts. In the following months, Germany's armies swept through Europe with astonishing speed. Denmark and Norway fell in April 1940. The Low Countries and France followed in May and June. Paris, the City of Light, fell after only 6 weeks of fighting. Nazi propaganda portrayed these victories as proof of German superiority and Hitler's genius, while at home rationing remained limited. and morale soared. But the conflict soon spread beyond the continent. In June 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union. Over 3 million German soldiers crossed the border aiming to crush communism and seize vast territories for German settlement. It was the largest military operation in history and a turning point of the war. Initial victories were spectacular. Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev fell in rapid succession. Yet as the Wehrmacht approached Moscow, the advance slowed. Winter descended with brutal force and Soviet resistance stiffened. What Hitler envisioned as a quick campaign became a grinding war of attrition. Total war at home. As the conflict widened, daily life in Germany grew harsher. Rationing of food, clothing, and fuel intensified. Cities prepared for air raids with blackout curtains and bomb shelters becoming household necessities. Women and older men filled factory jobs left vacant by soldiers. The government introduced longer work hours and stricter discipline, insisting that every citizen contribute to the war effort. Propaganda remained relentless. Joseph Goebbels used radio and film to frame the war as a defensive struggle against world Jewry and Bolshevism. After the catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad in early 1943, he delivered his infamous total war speech at Berlin's Sportpalast, urging Germans to sacrifice everything: comfort, leisure, even their lives for victory. Posters exhorted workers to produce more weapons, while children in the Hitler Youth collected scrap metal and manned anti-aircraft guns. The Holocaust intensifies. Conquest brought not only battles but genocide. The invasion of the Soviet Union marked the beginning of the final solution: the systematic extermination of European Jews. Einsatzgruppen executed hundreds of thousands in mass shootings from Ukraine to the Baltics. Soon, the regime built a network of death camps, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, equipped with gas chambers designed for industrial-scale killing. Millions of Jews, along with Roma, disabled people, Soviet prisoners of war, and others were murdered. Information about these atrocities reached ordinary Germans in fragments, whispers from soldiers on leave, rumors of trains that never returned. While many chose not to know, others sensed the truth. Diaries from the era record unease and disbelief, yet open protest was rare. Fear of the Gestapo and years of propaganda had narrowed the moral space for action. The tide turns. Despite early triumphs, Germany's fortune shifted after 1942. The failed siege of Stalingrad cost hundreds of thousands of soldiers and shattered the myth of invincibility. In North Africa, the Afrika Korps under Erwin Rommel suffered defeat at El Alamein. Allied bombing campaigns devastated German cities from Hamburg to Dresden, turning neighborhoods to ash and killing tens of thousands of civilians. On June 6, 1944, D-Day Allied forces landed in Normandy, opening a western front that pressed Germany from two directions. The Soviet Red Army advanced relentlessly from the east, reclaiming territory and pushing toward Berlin. The war that Hitler had imagined as a swift expansion of empire became a desperate fight for survival. Life under bombs and shortages. For civilians, these final years were marked by fear and deprivation. Air raid sirens wailed almost nightly. Families huddled in basements or underground shelters as bombs rained down, shattering homes and incinerating entire blocks. Food became scarce. Bread was stretched with sawdust and meat was a rare luxury. Children were evacuated from major cities to the countryside, separated from parents for months or years. Yet the regime demanded unwavering loyalty. Propaganda insisted that miraculous wonder weapons, the V-1 and V-2 rockets, would turn the tide. Hitler Youth units, some as young as 12, were armed and sent to the front or to man anti-aircraft batteries. Desperation fueled fanaticism and resistance remained dangerous. Those suspected of defeatism or listening to Allied radio faced imprisonment or execution. Collapse of the Reich. By early 1945, the Third Reich was crumbling. The Allies crossed the Rhine from the west while Soviet forces encircled Berlin. Cities lay in ruins. Millions were homeless or displaced. On April 30th, as Soviet troops closed in, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. Within a week, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The human cost was staggering. Historians estimate that between 60 and 70 million people died worldwide during World War II, including 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust. German military deaths exceeded 5 million. Civilian casualties from bombing, starvation, and displacement numbered in the millions more. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted just 12. Aftermath and reckoning. In the war's wake, Germany was a shattered land. Cities were piles of rubble. Infrastructure lay in ruins. Millions of refugees wandered amid the wreckage. The country was divided into occupation zones, eventually forming the Democratic Federal Republic of Germany in the west and the Communist German Democratic Republic in the east. Rebuilding would take decades. The Nuremberg trials exposed the crimes of Nazi leaders documenting genocide, aggressive war, and crimes against humanity. For ordinary Germans, the trials forced a confrontation with the atrocities committed in their name. Some reacted with denial or defensiveness, others with shame and a determination to rebuild a more just society. The end of illusions. The descent into global war revealed the true nature of the Nazi project. The economic miracle, the rallies, the promises of unity and strength, all were preparation for conquest and annihilation. The people's community that once seemed to offer stability had in fact mobilized an entire nation for destruction. For those who survived, the reckoning was personal as well as national. Soldiers returned to ruins. Mothers mourned lost sons. Children raised in Hitler youth camps faced a world where their indoctrination meant nothing. In the ashes of the Reich, Germans grappled with hard questions about complicity, morality, and the ease with which a modern society had followed a path to catastrophe. The story of Nazi Germany's road to war is a cautionary tale of ambition, without restraint, of how charismatic leadership and economic revival can mask deadly intentions. It stands as a warning: when a nation trades freedom for the promise of greatness, it may gain neither and lose everything. By the spring of 1945, Germany was a nation in ruins, physically shattered, morally devastated, and facing an uncertain future. The grand vision of a 1,000-year Reich had ended after barely 12. Cities lay in smoking heaps. Millions were dead or displaced, and the social fabric that once held the country together was frayed to the point of disintegration. The final days of the Third Reich. As Allied armies converged from east and west, daily life in Germany dissolved into chaos. Soviet forces pushed relentlessly from the east, exacting revenge for years of brutal occupation. From the west, American, British, and French troops advanced across the Rhine. Refugees, many of them women, children, and elderly men, clogged the roads, fleeing bombardment and the approaching Red Army. Towns that had been pristine showcases of Nazi order now echoed with the rumble of artillery and the wails of the displaced. Inside Berlin, the reality was stark. Food was scarce, electricity unreliable, and the once grand avenues were reduced to rubble-strewn corridors. Hitler, refusing to abandon the capital, retreated to the subterranean Führer bunker with a shrinking inner circle. There, amid concrete walls and stale air, he clung to fantasies of counterattacks and miracle weapons that might reverse the tide. Loyal followers carried out his orders even as Soviet shells landed only streets away. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler shot himself alongside Eva Braun, whom he had married in a brief civil ceremony the day before. Joseph Goebbels and his wife followed, poisoning their 6 children before taking their own lives. Without its leader, the Nazi government collapsed rapidly. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, appointed Hitler's successor, attempted to negotiate a partial surrender, but the Allies demanded unconditional capitulation. On May 7th in Reims, and again on May 8th in Berlin, Germany formally surrendered. A nation in ruins. The scale of destruction defied comprehension. Allied bombing campaigns had reduced major cities Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, Berlin to skeletal remains. Bridges, railways, and factories lay twisted and blackened. Millions of homes were uninhabitable, leaving countless families to shelter in cellars or improvised huts. Agricultural production had collapsed, causing food shortages that persisted for years. The once vaunted Autobahn served as a reminder that infrastructure designed for conquest could not feed the hungry or rebuild a shattered society. Civilian casualties were staggering. Historians estimate that more than 3 million German civilians died during the war. many from bombing raids, starvation, or exposure during mass evacuations. In the East, the Soviet advance brought widespread atrocities, including mass rapes and reprisals against civilians. Entire communities were uprooted as borders shifted and ethnic Germans fled or were expelled from territories such as East Prussia, Silesia, and the Sudetenland. The psychological toll was equally profound. Survivors grappled with grief for lost relatives, guilt for their own survival, and the trauma of prolonged fear. Children who had once sung Hitler youth anthems now wandered through ruins, scavenging for food and trying to comprehend the collapse of the world they had been taught was invincible. Division and occupation. In the immediate aftermath, Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones administered by the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and later France. The Allies faced the immense task of feeding millions, restoring basic services, and dismantling the remnants of the Nazi state. Cities like Berlin, already a wasteland, were further partitioned into sectors that would foreshadow the geopolitical tensions of the Cold War. The occupation authorities initiated denazification, a process aimed at removing former Nazis from positions of influence and educating the population about the regime's crimes. Teachers, judges, and civil servants were screened. Those deemed complicit faced dismissal or trial. Yet the sheer number of people who had joined the party, whether from conviction, opportunism, or coercion, made complete purges impossible. Many who had once worn the swastika quietly resumed professional lives, a pragmatic compromise that sparked debate for decades. Nuremberg and the confrontation with crimes. Perhaps the most visible reckoning came with the Nuremberg trials beginning in November 1945. For the first time in history, an international tribunal prosecuted leaders of a defeated state for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and aggressive war. 24 high-ranking officials, including Hermann Göring, Joachim von Ribbentrop, and Albert Speer, faced detailed evidence of atrocities, the Holocaust, mass execution, slave labor, and the waging of a war of aggression. The trials exposed the inner workings of the regime to the world and to the German people themselves. Films of concentration camps with their emaciated survivors and piles of corpses were shown in court and later in public screenings. Many Germans confronted with undeniable evidence experienced a mixture of horror, denial, and shame. Others clung to the belief that they had been misled or bore no responsibility. The moral reckoning was uneven and painful, but it forced a society-wide confrontation with the depths of Nazi brutality. Human displacement and the refugee crisis. The end of the war triggered one of the largest population movements in European history. Millions of displaced persons, former forced laborers, concentration camp survivors, prisoners of war, wandered the continent seeking food, shelter, and a path home. At the same time, ethnic Germans were expelled or fled from Eastern Europe as borders shifted westward. Entire families trekked for weeks, pushing carts piled with what little they could carry, often facing violence and deprivation. Allied authorities established displaced persons camps offering rudimentary shelter and rations. In these crowded facilities, survivors of the Holocaust attempted to piece together shattered lives, search for lost relatives, and decide whether to emigrate or remain in Europe. For many Jews, returning to pre-war homes was unthinkable. Anti-Semitism persisted and entire communities had been destroyed. The camps became both places of grief and gradually of renewal, as survivors married, had children, and planned futures far from the continent that had betrayed them. Reconstruction and the Cold War divide. As the 1940s progressed, the political landscape of occupied Germany hardened into 2 distinct states. In 1949, the Western zones merged to form the Federal Republic of Germany. West Germany aligned with the United States and its allies. The Soviet zone became the German Democratic Republic East Germany, a communist state under Moscow's influence. Berlin, located deep within East Germany, was itself split into East and West sectors, a division that would culminate in the Berlin Wall of 1961. Reconstruction in the West benefited from the Marshall Plan, the American initiative that poured billions of dollars into rebuilding Europe. Cities slowly rose from rubble factories restarted and democratic institutions took root. East Germany rebuilt under a socialist model with central planning and close ties to the Soviet Union. The once unified nation now stood at the front line of the Cold War, a living symbol of global ideological conflict. Memory guilt and renewal. For Germans, the post-war years brought an enduring struggle with memory and responsibility. Many families avoided discussing the war's moral questions, focusing instead on survival and rebuilding. Others engaged in painful introspection, asking how a cultured, educated society could have followed Hitler into catastrophe. Writers, theologians, and philosophers debated concepts of collective guilt and the capacity for evil within modern civilization. The younger generation coming of age in the 1950s and 1960s often challenged their parents' silence. Student movements demanded full acknowledgement of the Holocaust and the crimes of the regime, pushing West Germany toward a more open confrontation with its past. In East Germany, the communist government emphasized anti-fascist resistance while downplaying its own authoritarianism, creating a different but equally selective memory. Over time, Germany undertook a remarkable transformation. Memorials to Holocaust victims, restitution programs for survivors, and rigorous history education became central to national identity. The phrase "nie wieder," never again, emerged as a guiding moral imperative. Lessons of the collapse. The fall of Nazi Germany stands as a grim testament to the dangers of unchecked power and the seduction of authoritarian promises. What began as a movement offering stability and national pride ended in unparalleled destruction and genocide. The regime's ability to harness technology, propaganda, and modern administration for mass murder revealed the capacity of a modern state to commit ancient evils on an industrial scale. Yet the aftermath also offers a measure of hope. Out of devastation arose a democratic Germany committed to human rights and reconciliation. The very society that once embraced tyranny eventually became a leading voice for peace and European unity. Its journey from perpetrator to advocate for remembrance and justice remains one of the most striking moral arcs of the modern era. The collapse of the Third Reich was not merely the end of a government, it was a reckoning for a people and a warning for humanity. The ruins of Berlin, the testimonies of survivors, and the solemn memorials that now stand across Germany remind the world of how fragile civilization can be and how vital it is to defend the principles of freedom, dignity, and truth.